Alright, if you are the average British person, then you don't actually celebrate Halloween. Surveys have consistently found that only a minority of the country gets involved in it. And when people were asked why they don't celebrate Halloween, the top 3 reasons given were don't like it, it's for children, and it's American. Now I know there are many people older than myself who have no memory of Halloween being a thing when they were growing up. But these days it's huge. Hundreds of millions of pounds are spent on it every year. So I wanted to try and dig into the history of Halloween, try and work out how it became as big as it is today, and maybe try and work out whether it really is an American import. But this has actually been one of the most frustrating things I've tried to research, because when I look at stuff like this, I'm trying to find some facts, find some answers, but then I'm also trying to piece them together into some kind of cohesive story that I can tell in a video. But doing that in this case has been really challenging, as you will see. The first element of Halloween that I wanted to tackle was trick-or-treating, the practice of kids knocking on front doors and asking for sweets. So I had a look in the British newspaper archive, which is a resource I use quite a lot. And if you search for trick-or-treat, you can see right away that the use of this term exploded in the 1980s. I also had a look at Hansard, which is the official record of debates in Parliament, and it seems that the first mention of trick-or-treating there was in 1986, when a member of the House of Lords described it as a recently imported custom. So we're definitely closing in on the 1980s as the time when trick-or-treating really took off in the UK. But why? Well, a lot of sources that I found said that you can trace the rise of trick-or-treating in the UK back to the film E.T. And that film does contain a scene where E.T. and the kids in the neighborhood go trick-or-treating. But how can we prove that that film led directly to this trend? I was hoping to find maybe some newspaper articles from the time saying that there was this new trend and kids were copying it from E.T., but I couldn't find anything like that. And if you break down the newspaper archive by year, you'll see that there was a rise in the use of the term trick-or-treat throughout the 1980s, but it's not like there was a massive explosion the year after E.T. came out. And you can actually find some articles talking about trick-or-treating in Britain from years earlier. The American custom of trick-or-treat was well in evidence at Munford on Halloween when several groups of youngsters toured the village. I also found a TV listing from all the way back in 1965 showing that the BBC was airing the American sitcom Bewitched, and specifically an episode which is all about trick-or-treating. So clearly trick-or-treating didn't just take off overnight in Britain, it was probably something that people were becoming aware of throughout the 60s and the 70s. But to be fair, I think E.T. probably did play a role in that, because E.T. wasn't just any film. When it came out, it was actually the highest grossing film of all time, both in Britain and globally. And it held that title for the entire rest of the 80s. So okay, maybe trick-or-treating is an American import. But what if you trace it back even further than that? Because how did it become such a big thing in America? Well, it seems like trick-or-treating kind of spread across America between the 1930s and the 1950s. But a few decades before that, it actually started off across the border in Canada. So many British people might see trick-or-treating as an American import, but I don't know how many Americans are aware that for them it's actually a Canadian import. But the story doesn't end there either, because before Canadians started trick-or-treating, they had a very similar practice which was called guising, as in disguising, and that came over to Canada from its original home in Scotland and Ireland. I found some mentions of this in Scottish newspapers way before the 1980s, often from people complaining that the youth of today just don't guise like they used to, because as part of guising, kids were supposed to not only knock on doors, but they were supposed to kind of sing little songs or do little performances, basically as a way to earn the sweets or whatever the householders would give them. Halloween comes vividly to mind, and as I remember it, we only went guising after much rehearsal. We introduced ourselves with a jingle, which I'm not going to try and perform, and after that introduction we said, sang, or danced our piece. We're generally regaled with cakes and lemonade, and sometimes on leaving with sweets or fruit. Sir, even the good old Halloween custom of guising seems to have deteriorated, like everything else since the war. The youngsters who go out may be in fancier dresses and get-ups than of old, but like many of the present government supporters, appear to think that they should get their alms merely for the asking. And separately in parts of England there was a different practice called souling, and I found this account in a newspaper from 1970, but it's someone recounting their childhood, which was in the 1890s, I think. November 1st, All Saints' Day, was, I think, among our happiest memories. We had a full day off from school, which we devoted to souling. That is, going around in family groups to sing outside the homes of anyone who in return would give us fruitcakes or money. Both guising and souling seem to have taken place around the same time as Halloween. It seems like guising might have been something you could do throughout October, and souling was on the 1st of November. But it's easy to see how over time, and with these customs traveling to another continent, they merged and changed and ended up becoming trick-or-treating as we know it today. So when that trend made its way back across the Atlantic in the 1980s, many people in parts of England and Wales might have seen it as this new weird American thing that was coming over, but people in Scotland and Ireland might have just seen it as kind of a new twist on an existing tradition. I found a letter someone wrote about this to the Scottish newspaper The Daily Record in 1988. With Halloween almost upon us, may I offer a word of advice to youngsters? If you are going out guising and intend calling at my door, please note the following. Yes, I will be need-in-only guisers, and will be pleased to welcome any children prepared to do a recitation, sing a song, do a wee dance or whatever, in return for a small reward of nuts or sweets. I enjoy trying to guess who's behind the soot. No, I will not be at home to trick-or-treat kids who come to the door expecting money. I do not encourage beggars. Trick-or-treat is symptomatic of the grab-it-all American society from whence it came, and has no part in our Scottish traditions, which expect some effort for a reward. So is trick-or-treating an American import? Well, yes, but they got it from Canada, and Canada got it from Scotland and Ireland, so the next element of the mystery would be the jack-o'-lantern, although I don't think we really use that term. I think that's more of an American thing. I think we just tend to call them pumpkins or Halloween pumpkins or something. But maybe that's because in this case it really is something that came over from America, because pumpkins aren't native to Europe. They did come over from the Americas. And we don't really use them for much else outside of Halloween, really. But in America, they're more of a big thing. They have their pumpkin spice lattes, their pumpkin pie, pumpkin cowboys. But we have been making spooky lanterns out of vegetables for a lot longer than that. We just used to make them out of turnips instead. I found this account from 1937, and again, it's someone reminiscing about their childhood, so even longer ago than that. And they described making a lantern out of a turnip, including scooping out the insides, putting a candle inside, and making a scary face on the side of it. So this is another thing where we had a tradition, it made its way over to America, it got changed around a bit, and then the American version made its way back over here. So at this point I thought, okay, so trick-or-treating and pumpkin carving, both kind of American, kind of not. But then I thought, well, there is another festivity that takes place around the same time of year that you definitely can trace back to a very particular place in time, because as far as I know, it hasn't really traveled to any part of the world other than this country. And that is, remember, the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Night, Bonfire Night, Fireworks Night, whatever you call it. Because I think what a lot of people feel is that the potential Americanization of Halloween has sort of diluted the impact of our more traditional British 5th of November thing. So I thought it would be interesting to look back at the history of that festivity as well, see how the two of them have interacted over the years. But in the process of doing that, I ended up finding something that I thought was the missing piece to this whole video, but instead just ended up being really weird and kind of confusing. Now, although the 5th of November has been a celebration for hundreds of years, the way that it's celebrated has changed over time. These days it's mostly a nighttime thing where you gather around a bonfire and either watch a professional fireworks display or set off some of your own fireworks in the safety of your back garden. But for a lot of the 20th century, there was a daytime element to the celebration, as children would make an effigy of Guy Fawkes and carry him around in a wheelbarrow and ask people to give them a penny for the guy, which they would then use to buy the fireworks for that evening's celebrations.
How much did you give him? A penny. A penny? Yeah. Is that what you normally give? Yeah, I didn't give a penny. Now, why did you give a penny to the guys? Well, I don't think he's got a fat score. I think for the boys. Just for the boys, yeah. Just get a few fireworks.
And as I was looking into this, I had a feeling that it was going to make a great contrast to Halloween, because Halloween might be Americanized, but the 5th of November is definitely a British thing, and Halloween might be very commercialized, but I think the 5th of November is still seen as a little bit more traditional. But then I found a claim that I thought was pretty extraordinary. It's a claim that can be found on a few different websites. It's on Wikipedia, although it doesn't seem to cite a source. And it's on the BBC website, where it's part of BBC Bitesize, which is their resource to help teenagers studying for exams. And the claim is this: in 1910, fireworks manufacturers started branding the 5th of November as Fireworks Night to cash in on the act. It saw their sales increase by 20% year on year. Enthusiastic children would create a Guy Fawkes effigy, which they carried around asking for a penny for the guy to help them buy fireworks. Now that would mean that the modern incarnation of the 5th of November celebration was explicitly a commercial invention. And I thought, this is great, but I've got basically a twist ending for my video where it turns out that the 5th of November, as we know it today, is also essentially a commercial holiday. So maybe the lesson is that we basically just have to stop worrying about that and try and have some fun. But I couldn't just take that paragraph and put it into my video because I still had loads of questions. What happened in 1910? And which firework manufacturers are we talking about? Did they all somehow agree to do this in 1910 specifically? And how did they do it? Was this like a newspaper ad campaign or what? So I went back to the newspaper archive to see what I could dig up from 1910, but I couldn't really find anything relevant. But then I looked elsewhere. It turns out there's a website called fireworkads.co.uk where you can just look up loads of old firework ads. It's one of those great websites from back when there really was a website for everything. So I had a look on there and I still couldn't find anything to do with this. In fact, I found this advert from 1911, which is still using the phrase Guy Fawkes Day, even though this is apparently the year after the manufacturers had decided to start branding it as Fireworks Night. So did they just not get the memo or what? I thought I must be missing something, so I tried asking around, trying to find people who knew things about the history of fireworks in Britain. And I ended up speaking to a man named Steve Allison, who not only owns his own firework company called Northern Lights Fireworks, but is currently preparing to do a PhD on British fireworks history, and he was described to me as the biggest authority on the history of fireworks in Britain. And here is what he told me. None of my primary source material collected over the last 25 years points to 1910 being particularly different to many other years. He did speculate that because King Edward VII died in May of 1910, maybe fireworks companies might have seen a lull in sales that year due to the period of mourning, and that might have led them to try and push the 5th of November a little bit harder that year to try and make up for lost sales. But he also said there are multiple accounts of people letting off fireworks on the 5th of November before 1910, and as far as he knows, fireworks were already pretty well established as part of the celebrations by that point. So I don't know what's going on here. This pretty remarkable fact is either so well known that it made it onto BBC Bitesize, and yet so obscure that neither I nor a British fireworks expert could find any evidence to support it, or it's not true, in which case, how did it end up there? But at this point, I kind of felt like I'd hit a brick wall with this video. I had all these different pieces that kind of fit together, but I couldn't quite shape them into a proper narrative. And there was still one thing I just didn't understand. What is it about trick-or-treating that meant that from Canada to America to here in Britain, it was able to replace these older traditions of guising and souling? What gave it so much power? But then I found one final article from 1971. This is a very early mention of trick-or-treating in Britain. It doesn't seem to have quite caught on yet at this point, but the article is about a group of Scottish Girl Guides, or Americans would call them Girl Scouts, who were invited to celebrate Halloween on an American military base. The houses on the base were decorated with witches, broomsticks, etc., and the children from 1 year upwards were dressed in some very elaborate costumes. The evening started off with the guides taking part in the traditional American custom of trick-or-treat. The children knocked on the doors and said to the occupants, "Trick or treat," the idea being that if they did not get a treat, a trick was played on the householder later. And at the end of the article, it says that 2 of the Girl Guides later commented that they much preferred the American trick-or-treating to traditional guising. So I think after all this research, the real answer to why the modern version of Halloween took off so much in Britain is just as simple as because kids enjoyed it. Happy Halloween.